My name is Nancy Roberts. I'm an economics professor at Arizona State University. Today's video is going to be about cross-price elasticity. We've done a series of videos on elasticity. This one measures how closely related two goods are. Some goods are related as substitutes. For example, Coke and Pepsi. They're substitutes for one another. Some goods are related as complements, such as tennis rackets and tennis balls. And so what we want to measure is what happens to the demand for one of those goods when the price of the related good changes. And we actually have a way to measure this. And of course, it ought to make sense that producers are interested. I mean, the producer of Pepsi is very interested in what's going to happen to the demand when the price of Coke changes. So our measure, the way we measure cross-price elasticity is using this formula. It's the percentage change in the demand for, let's just say, good X, when there is some percentage change in the price of good Y. So, if the price of Coke changes, what happens to the demand for Pepsi? Or if the price of Pepsi changes, what happens to the demand for Coke? Or if the price of tennis balls change, what happens to the demand for tennis rackets? And so, we can just look, let's just put an example here. I'm going to have, this will be Pepsi, and this will be Coke. There's a demand for Pepsi, there's a demand for Coke. And over here, so these are substitutes. Over here I'm going to put complements. I'm going to put tennis balls and tennis rackets. There's a demand for tennis rackets, there's a demand for tennis balls, there's a demand for Coke, demand for Pepsi. If the price of Pepsi increases from P1 to P2, we know what happens in the Pepsi market. Quantity demanded decreases. That's what happens in the Pepsi market. But the question is, does anything happen in the Coke market? Well, if the price of Pepsi goes up from P1 to P2, the quantity demanded of Pepsi decreases from Q1 to Q2. Now, all of these people who used to buy Pepsi when it was P1, they just give up soda pop. I'm not having soda pop anymore because the price of Pepsi went up. Or do they say, now that Pepsi is more expensive relative to Coke than it was before, some of these people will switch over here and join the Coke market. And so what we will see is an increase in demand for Coke because the price of Pepsi went up. And what's important here to remember is it doesn't matter what the price of Coke was originally. It doesn't matter. If Pepsi went up from 50 cents to $1 and Coke was $1 to start with, you're still going to see people move to the Coke market because Coke originally, when Pepsi was 50 cents and Coke was $1, Coke was twice as expensive as Pepsi. Now, when Pepsi goes up to $1, they're the same price. The relative price is now the same. And so there were people who would buy Pepsi when it cost half as much as Coke, but now that it's going to cost as much as Coke, they're going to switch to Coke. So the original price of Coke doesn't matter. Let's just call it P squiggle. It doesn't matter what the price was. It doesn't matter if it was greater than, less than, or the same as this. It's the relative price that's important. So relative to Pepsi, Coke is now less expensive. Okay, let's go over here to the tennis ball and tennis racket market. If the price of tennis balls goes up from $2 a can to $3 a can, we are going to sell fewer cans of tennis balls. The question is, what happens to the demand for tennis rackets if the price of tennis balls goes up? Well, these things have to be used together. You can't play tennis without a racket and balls. So a tennis racket's useless without tennis balls. So what's going to happen over here in the tennis racket market? Well, what's happened is your activity has just gotten more expensive. Every time you go out to play tennis, it's now going to cost you $3 instead of $2. More expensive hobby, more expensive activity. So a way that you can try and mitigate this increase in cost is to try and stretch out the life of your racket. I mean, if you originally replace your racket every year, then what will happen is you will treat your racket with more respect when it doesn't do what you tell it to do. Instead of throwing it, you'll just talk to it and say, you know, you shouldn't have done that. You'll have your racket restrung more often. You'll have the grip rewrapped. And instead of replacing your racket every year, you'll make your racket last 18 months. So if this is the demand for tennis rackets per year, given that we're going to make our racket last longer, then what's going to happen over here in a year's time, the demand will decrease a little bit because we're going to make them last a year and a half. So the demand every year will shrink a bit. So these goods are complements, and the increase in price over here will cause a decrease in demand here. These goods are substitutes. The increase in price will cause an increase in demand over here. And again, as you can see, we have ways to measure how big this response is going to be, how big this response is going to be. And we'll work an example of that in the next video.